The rain in Chicago didn't fall like it did in other cities. It didn't wash the streets clean. It soaked into the concrete, heavy, slow, like it was listening. That's the kind of city Tony Accardo grew up in. Cold, watching, always listening. They called him Joe Batters because he beat two men to death with a baseball bat. Not in some alley, not for show. In a room with four other men watching, none of whom ever spoke of it again. The name stuck. The legend started. But before the name, before the suit, before the quiet stares and whispers that followed him into every room, there was just Tony. A kid from the West Side, born in 1906 to Sicilian immigrants. His father was a shoemaker. Honest hands, tired hands, the kind that worked until they cracked. Tony didn't want those hands. He wanted more. He started small, like they all did, sneaking off with local hoods, rolling dice, boosting cars. By the time he was 15, he'd already done time in juvenile detention. That's where he learned two things: keep your mouth shut and never beg. The first rule kept him alive. The second made people afraid of him. When he was around 18, he caught the eye of Al Capone. Not because he made noise. Tony didn't do noise. He followed orders. He moved sharp and silent, like a knife in the dark. Capone liked that. Men who didn't talk back. Men who didn't talk at all. Capone brought him in as an enforcer, muscle. But Tony wasn't just muscle. He listened, he watched, he learned. And when the time came, he hit harder than anyone. They say the nickname came one night in the early 30s, two traitors, a bat, and Accardo didn't flinch. Capone walked out of that room and told someone, "This kid's a real Joe Batters." The newspapers ran with Big Tuna years later, after a photo of him surfaced on a fishing trip in Miami. But the men who knew, they called him Joe Batters, because they knew what he could do when it got personal. He wasn't flashy like Capone. He didn't crave headlines. He didn't throw parties or drink himself stupid in clubs. He was quiet. The kind of quiet that made your bones itch. The kind that meant something bad was about to happen, and if you were smart, you walked the other way. By the time Capone went down, sick and bleeding in his mind from syphilis, Tony was already watching from the second row. Not too close, never too far. He moved like smoke, and when Capone fell, Tony stepped closer to the fire. He didn't take over right away. That wasn't his way. He waited, played loyal, watched others burn themselves out. Frank Nitti, Paul Ricca, all leaders with louder mouths and shorter lives. Accardo outlived them all. What made Tony different wasn't just the violence. Plenty of men could pull a trigger. But Tony, he understood business, he understood loyalty, and most of all, he understood fear. Not the kind that screamed, the kind that whispered. He ran the Chicago outfit with precision, no drugs, too messy, no unnecessary headlines. If you got caught, you did time and kept your mouth shut. If you didn't, you disappeared. No body, no noise. His house in River Forest was modest, at least by mob standards, brick, clean. Neighbors said he was quiet, polite even. They'd see him cutting his grass on Saturdays. Never mind the fact that more than one man who crossed him ended up face down in the Chicago River. That was business. He never did more time than a night or two behind bars. Never got hit with the big charges. Every time they came close, something slipped. A witness changed their mind. Evidence vanished. Tony didn't beat the system. He owned it. Even in retirement, he pulled strings, sat back, let the younger ones do the dirty work. But he always knew what was happening, always. And when someone forgot who really ran things, someone paid a price, a high price. He lived to be 86, died in his bed, no bullets, no blood, just gone. That's the thing. For all the killing, all the fear, all the broken lives he left in his shadow, he got what no gangster ever really gets: peace. But don't mistake that for mercy. Because Tony Joe Batters Accardo didn't believe in mercy. He believed in order, loyalty, and silence. And the streets of Chicago, they still remember. The streets in Chicago in the 1920s didn't just smell like smoke and gasoline. They smelled like hunger. Hunger for money, hunger for respect, hunger for something bigger than the name you were born with. Tony Accardo didn't grow up dreaming of power. He didn't dream at all. Dreaming was for kids with soft hands and full plates. He came from dirt, from cracked sidewalks and men who coughed too much. There was no romance to it. It was survival. By the time Tony was running small jobs for street bosses, Chicago was already bleeding from inside. Capone ran the South Side like it was his kingdom, and the police weren't lawmen. They were business partners. The only real rule was this: don't get in the way of the outfit. Tony didn't just follow that rule, he lived by it. See, back then, the outfit wasn't some name you read in papers. It wasn't organized the way TV makes you think. It was a breathing thing, full of clicks, crews, whispers. At the top, Alphonse Capone. Everyone knew his name. Big smile, fat cigars, silk suits. But the real power, the real control, didn't come from flash. It came from the shadows. That's where Tony made his name. They say his first job under Capone was simple. A lookout on a bootlegging run, nothing glamorous. But Tony didn't blink. He didn't talk. He didn't panic when the coppers drove by. He stood still, cold, focused. Capone noticed. Tony moved up fast. Not because he asked for it, because he didn't. He followed orders to the letter. He didn't question, didn't try to impress. And when a job needed muscle, real muscle, the kind that left a message, Tony delivered. One night in a warehouse on the South Side, Tony was handed a baseball bat. Two men were tied to chairs. They'd skimmed money, lied to Capone's face. Tony was told what to do. No bullets, no knives, just the bat. And he did it. He didn't yell, didn't sweat. He swung that bat with a calm most men didn't understand. Broke bones like it was routine. The sound of the wood cracking against skull echoed through that warehouse. No music, no shouting, just breathing. Heavy, controlled. The sound of power-changing hands. Capone watched from the shadows, and when it was done, when the room smelled like blood and sawdust, he looked at Tony and smiled. This kid's a real Joe Batters. The nickname stuck like dried blood. But that moment, that job, it wasn't about violence. It was about trust. Capone gave Tony a test, and Tony proved something that night. He would do what needed to be done. No questions, no hesitation. That's when the outfit started whispering about him, not loud. You didn't talk loud about Joe Batters, but men began stepping aside when he walked into a room. He didn't have to bark orders. He didn't need a crew of hangers-on. His silence was louder than any pistol. He wasn't flashy like Frank Nitti, Capone's right hand. He wasn't as smooth as Paul Ricca, the brains behind the books. Tony was a different breed. He didn't want the spotlight. He wanted the machine to run, clean, efficient, unstoppable. Capone liked loyalty, but more than that, he respected fear. Tony didn't demand respect. He let the fear do the talking. But things were changing. The feds were closing in on Capone. Not for murder, not for bootlegging, for taxes, of all things. That's how it always went. The bullets didn't scare the government, but the money trail, that's what made them pull out the knives. Tony saw it coming before anyone else. Capone was too loud, too visible. Every party, every headline. It made enemies. It made targets. Tony stayed quiet, kept his head low. While the others drank and laughed, Tony watched. He watched Capone get sentenced in 1931, 11 years in prison. That's when the outfit held its breath. Everyone thought the machine would break without Capone, but it didn't, not even close. Because men like Tony didn't need Capone. They were the machine. Frank Nitti stepped up as front man, but everyone in the back rooms knew. Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo were the real architects now. Ricca handled the books. Tony handled the streets. The outfit evolved. Drugs were out, too risky. Prostitution was cleaned up. Gambling, unions, construction. The money started flowing in ways bullets never could. And Tony? He orchestrated it like a man playing chess on a board soaked in blood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't wave his arms. But if you crossed him, you didn't get a warning. You got a vanishing act. Tony believed in two things above all: order and loyalty. You kept your mouth shut. You showed up, and you never embarrassed the family. The men who broke those rules didn't get to apologize. There was a man, quiet, low level, but he ran his mouth one night at a bar, drunk, loud, saying too much about who he worked for, what he'd seen. The next morning, They found him in the trunk of his car. No fingers, no tongue. No one mentioned it again. Tony didn't just send messages. He was the message. But it wasn't all killings and threats. That's the mistake people make when they talk about mob bosses. The real power wasn't in violence. It was in the absence of it, knowing that the man across the table could end you with a nod and choosing not to. That's where Tony thrived. By the 1940s, the Chicago outfit was more than a gang. It was a business empire. Casinos in Vegas, unions in their pocket, judges, cops, city officials, bought and paid for. Tony made it so the outfit didn't need to hide in shadows anymore. They were the system, just with quieter suits. He bought a house in River Forest, not huge, not gaudy. Suburban, brick, manicured lawn. Neighbors waved to him, called him Mr. Accardo. He smiled back, took care of the block, sent gifts during the holidays. But inside those walls, inside that quiet little house, that's where deals were made, lives were decided, and once you walked out of Tony Accardo's living room with his approval, you knew one thing. You owed him forever. He never forgot a favor. Never forgot a betrayal either. Tony kept records in his head. Quiet men always do. He once told a younger soldier, "You do the work right, you sleep good. You mess it up, you don't sleep at all." The kid laughed. 6 months later, that same kid skimmed off the top. No one saw him again. They said Tony took him out to the woods himself, didn't even bring backup, just walked him out, quiet, under the trees. The kid begged, cried, but Tony didn't say a word. The next week, Tony went back to cutting his grass. Years passed. Bosses rose and fell. Wars broke out in New York. Blood ran in the streets of Detroit and Philly. But in Chicago, Tony kept it tight, clean, his way. He wasn't immortal. He knew that. But he also knew something better. He was untouchable. Because while the FBI hunted down mob bosses with big mouths and dirty hands, Tony kept his nails clean. He never ordered a hit on paper, never touched a drug deal, never signed a thing. But everything that moved in Chicago, every bet, every stolen crate, every union vote, ran through Joe Batters. And somehow, in the middle of all of it, he slept like a baby. The hardest thing to do in the world Tony Accardo lived in wasn't making money. It wasn't pulling off hits or laundering cash or bribing a judge. That was the easy part. The hardest thing? Staying alive. And not just alive, but powerful, respected, in control. That was what separated guys like Tony from the hundreds of street soldiers who ended up dead before 30. Because most of them were in it for the rush, the heat, the cars, the girls, the headlines. Tony wasn't. He was in it to last. By the 1940s, Al Capone was out of the picture. His mind was rotting from disease, locked away in Florida like a fallen king nobody wanted to visit. Frank Nitti had taken over officially, but Nitti was fragile, an alcoholic, moody, more mouth than brain. The outfit needed order. It needed someone who didn't panic, who didn't let feelings get in the way. That's when Paul Ricca stepped in and started sharing control with Accardo. Paul was the planner, the tactician. He saw the long game. But he also knew that you couldn't run a criminal empire just by numbers and ledgers, not when the streets ran hot. That's why he brought Tony closer. Tony understood the streets like they were written into his DNA. He didn't flinch. He didn't guess. He knew how the machine moved, where it could break, and where it needed oil. Together, Ricca and Accardo became what the FBI quietly called the duo of the underworld. They weren't loud like the New York families. They didn't fight over corners or parade down the street in Cadillacs. They built something smarter. See, under Tony's hand, the outfit got disciplined. Gambling wasn't just backroom dice games anymore. It became a business. Casinos, racetracks, off-the-books betting parlors. All of it taxed, organized, and protected. Every dollar that passed through Chicago paid tribute to Tony's table, whether the man placing the bet knew it or not. Labor unions? Same story. You wanted your trucks to keep moving, your docks to stay open? You paid. Quietly. No threats. Just a handshake and the knowledge that if you didn't play ball, your drivers might end up sick, your supplies lost, your contracts disappeared. Tony never had to say it. That was the art of it. He never said it. You just understood. The brilliance of Accardo's rise wasn't just in what he built. It was in how little blood he spilled to do it. He didn't run wild like Capone. He didn't wage wars. He made it clear from the start. You get one warning. Just one. After that, it wasn't personal anymore. It was business. There was a story, not widely known but whispered in certain circles, about a bookmaker named Rizzo who started freelancing out of Cicero. He thought he was untouchable because he had friends in the union. He figured Accardo wouldn't notice one guy hustling on the side. Tony let him run. For a while. Then one morning, Rizzo's storefront burned down. Arson squad said it was faulty wiring. Everyone else knew better. Rizzo was seen that week boarding a bus from Miami. He never came back. Tony didn't need to send messages. The silence was louder. The real shift came when the outfit turned its eyes west to Las Vegas. Vegas was still young, neon lights, sand, and opportunity. The East Coast families were sniffing around, but they were too divided, too busy killing each other over old grudges. Chicago saw it differently. Las Vegas wasn't a battleground. It was a bank. And Tony? He wanted in. The outfit didn't just open casinos, they infiltrated them. Through front straw men and business partners who didn't ask too many questions. They supplied money to build, then used their influence in the unions to make sure the buildings went up without delays. Once the doors opened, the skimming began. Every night, chips turned into cash, and a percentage of that cash never hit the books. It was flown back to Chicago in unmarked envelopes, briefcases, sometimes even inside cakes. The government knew it. They just couldn't prove it. Tony made sure of that. He didn't touch a damn thing. His name never showed up on any document. He didn't even fly to Vegas, let the younger guys handle the sand and sun. He stayed in River Forest, mowing his lawn, waving at the mailman, eating dinner with his wife, all while millions flowed under his floorboards. That was the genius of Accardo. He ruled without ruling. Even the men inside the outfit sometimes forgot how deep his reach went. He let others take titles. Boss, underboss, street boss. But when the decisions mattered, when something went wrong, the call always came back to Tony. He answered. Always. Now, the FBI, they weren't stupid. They knew he was the brain, the backbone, the ghost behind the curtain. But they couldn't touch him. Not because he was slippery, because he was perfect. No dirty hands, no paper trail, no phone calls. When agents followed him, they got nothing. He went to church, to dinner, played cards in the basement with old friends. The occasional fishing trip, the kind that earned him the Big Tuna nickname when a reporter caught a picture of him holding a fish the size of a child. They tried tapping his phones. They tried flipping his men. Nothing stuck. Even when they flipped an accountant in the 1950s who swore Tony had ordered hits, moved money, run the whole show, the case crumbled. Lack of evidence, witness tampering, bad memories. Whatever it was, the feds had to walk away. Again. And every time they failed, Accardo smiled, not mockingly, not arrogantly, just calmly, like a man who already knew how the game would end. He aged like stone, never stopped dressing clean, never raised his voice. He was a father, a husband, a boss. He watched the outfit grow beyond his wildest childhood dreams, from bootleg whiskey to national influence, from street corners to boardrooms. And every step of the way, he stayed relevant, not by adapting, but by controlling the rhythm of change itself. If something needed to happen slower, Tony slowed it down. If someone was moving too fast, Tony stopped them. He had a rule. Never get high on your own headlines. He meant it. The young guys, they wanted to be stars. They wanted respect in the papers. Tony didn't need any of that. Respect didn't come from headlines. It came from the fact that when you walked into a room and saw him sitting there, already waiting, already knowing why you came, your throat went dry. Because you didn't lie to Tony. You didn't hide things from him. You brought the truth and hoped to God it was enough. But power comes with weight. Tony saw friends die. Old soldiers flipped, tried to run, ended up in ditches. He saw changes coming. Surveillance tech, undercover agents, RICO laws. He understood the rules were shifting. So he adjusted. He stepped back from the daily operations. Let the next generation take over. Men like Giancana, Ayupa, Cerrone. He was still the final word, but from a distance, a shadow on the wall. He taught by silence, led by stillness. And when one of the young bosses started making noise, getting too loud, flashing too much cash, making too many enemies, Tony made a call. That boss got arrested within the year. Coincidence? Nobody thought so. Tony didn't need to run things anymore. He already had. All he had to do now was watch. And that's what he did. Through the 1960s, the 70s, even the early 80s, men came and went. Some did time. Some got killed. Some turned rat and tried to bring the whole thing down. But Tony sat in his house, same one in River Forest, same bricks, same lawn, growing older, watching grandkids run through the yard while the FBI sat in cars down the block. They still watched him. Even in his 70s, even when he walked slower, talked less, they still knew if something big happened in Chicago, the man behind it all probably had dinner at 6 and went to bed before 10 OD. That's what made him the most dangerous of all. He didn't chase the throne. He built it and then made it invisible. There's a point in every man's life when he realizes that violence is no longer the loudest sound in the room. It's disappointment, the look, the silence, that unspoken weight that settles in the chest of whoever messed up. Tony Accardo had mastered that long before most of the outfit's young guns could even tie a tie. By the 1950s, Accardo wasn't just a man, he was a presence. He didn't walk into rooms to talk, he walked in to listen, to nod, to stare through the man across from him until that man either said the right thing or didn't say anything at all. And in that silence, decisions were made. Chicago didn't bleed like the other cities. New York had its 5 families, always at each other's throats. Bosses were shot in restaurants, car bombs in Brooklyn, wiretaps in every damn payphone. The headlines loved it. So did the FBI. But Chicago was calm, dead calm. Because Tony didn't tolerate noise. He didn't believe in mob wars, didn't believe in drawing blood just to prove a point. You didn't get respect through chaos, you got it through control. Through order. Through rules that were carved into the bones of the men under you. The rules were simple. Don't steal from the outfit. Don't lie to the boss. Don't get caught. And above all, don't embarrass the family. If you broke one, you might get a warning. Maybe. But if you broke 2, you were already dead. Vegas was booming now. Not the glittery Vegas of today, but something raw. Younger, still unsure of what it was becoming. The outfit helped define it. They didn't run the casinos with flash. They did it through contracts, construction, workers' unions, and skimmed profits. They bought the back rooms while other guys were chasing the front lights. Tony didn't fly out there much. He didn't need to. His people, trusted men with hard eyes and quiet mouths, handled the flow. Skimming was an art. You couldn't take too much, couldn't leave fingerprints. You pulled just enough from the count room before the money hit the books. A few percent here, a few thousand there. Multiplied by 10 casinos, that was millions. Clean, untaxed, and on a one-way flight back to Chicago. The Teamsters played their part too. The outfit controlled the union's pension fund, a river of cash ready to be loaned to casino developers at a friendly interest rate. If the developer paid, great. If they didn't, they vanished. Or the project went up in flames, sometimes both. And behind it all, behind every bag of cash, every handshake, every broken kneecap, was the ghost of Joe Batters. He was never seen, never heard. But every man in the room knew what would happen if they crossed the line. There was a guy, mid-level bookie, name doesn't matter, who tried to outsmart the system. He thought if he funneled some skim into a side business, something small, nobody would notice. He was wrong. The story goes that Tony invited him to dinner. Nothing fancy. Just a steakhouse in town, booth in the back. The guy showed up nervous but thinking maybe it was a misunderstanding. Tony didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse. He just asked a question. "You happy with what you've built?" The guy smiled, nodded, tried to act calm, said yes. Tony stared at him for a long time, took a sip of red wine, put the glass down and said, "Good. That'll make it easier to leave it behind." The next day, the guy was gone. His shop, burned, his accounts, frozen, his family moved out of state, and not a single soul in the outfit asked a thing. Because everyone knew, if Tony made the call, it was the right call. End of discussion. In the late 50s, the outfit hit what most would call their golden age. The New York families were cracking under internal pressure and FBI heat. But Chicago stayed tight, clean, and profitable. And it wasn't because of luck. It was because Tony trusted no one. Every man was watched. Every ear was listening. And if someone stepped out of line, they were corrected, either gently or permanently. He had a crew around him by now. Not kids, not hotheads, but seasoned men who understood how to move weight without making noise. They called Tony the man who knew everything. He wasn't the kind of boss who barked orders across the table. He asked one question, maybe two, and from the answers, he'd piece together the truth. He could smell a lie like a butcher smells spoiled meat, a crooked nose, half a blink, too much sweat. That's all he needed. And the moment he knew, he never let you see it. You'd walk away thinking maybe you fooled him. Maybe you bought yourself a little time. You didn't. Tony didn't confront. He corrected. Quietly, efficiently. And if you ever got the second meeting, you didn't get a third. The outfit expanded under Tony's distant but steady watch. They moved into Florida, into parts of California. Trucking, waste management, adult clubs, construction, every industry that touched cash was soon brushing shoulders with Chicago money. And everywhere they went, they brought one thing with them: Tony's rules. You don't talk, you don't get greedy, you don't act like a boss unless you're willing to die like one. Even other crime families respected that. The Gambinos in New York, they envied Chicago's order. The Detroit Partnership modeled themselves after it. Because while the other syndicates had bosses with egos the size of city blocks, Chicago had a ghost pulling the strings. A ghost that never left fingerprints. He didn't do drugs, didn't cheat on his wife, didn't flaunt cash. He played with his grandkids, went to church, tipped waiters well. He was the perfect boss. Untouchable, not just because of fear, but because he left no trail to touch. The FBI grew desperate. They watched, tapped, pressured men to flip, and still Accardo sat untouched. One agent described watching Tony in the 1960s and saying, "It was like chasing a ghost who mowed his lawn every Thursday." They tried building cases on skimming, murder conspiracies, gambling rings. Every time the cases fell apart, witnesses changed stories, evidence disappeared, judges retired mysteriously. It wasn't magic. It was Tony's machine running in perfect silence. But even perfect machines rust. By the late 60s, cracks were forming. Some of the younger men, Giancana, Spilotro, others, wanted more heat, more money, more power, more chaos. They got flashy, careless. They made deals with unstable partners. They drew too much attention. And Tony? He watched. He let them make their moves, let them believe the crown was theirs. Then, when the time came, he reminded them who they were dealing with. He didn't argue, didn't scold. He corrected. And the corrections were permanent. That's how Tony ruled, not with force, not with volume, but with something much heavier, certainty. You knew if you crossed him, your time was limited. You just didn't know when, but you'd feel it. In the quiet, in the phone calls that stopped coming, in the friends who started avoiding you. Then one morning, you'd walk to your car, and someone would be waiting. And by nightfall, Tony would be eating dinner with his wife, as if nothing happened at all. Because to him, it didn't. It was just business. By the late 1960s, Chicago still looked like it was in control. Money flowed, skimming operations were running like clockwork, the unions were locked down tight, the cops were quiet, and the judges even quieter. On the surface, it all looked solid. But Tony Accardo wasn't watching the surface. He never did. He listened to the small things, the missing envelope, the nervous twitch in a captain's eye, a name whispered too often in the wrong places. And what he heard was simple. The new generation didn't respect the silence. They respected noise. Men like Sam Giancana had stepped into the spotlight, flashy, loud, addicted to the cameras. Giancana was the kind of guy who couldn't breathe unless someone was watching. He had Hollywood actresses in his bed, made secret deals with the CIA, and ran his mouth like the outfit was his nightclub. That wasn't how Accardo built things. Tony believed in quiet power, the kind that moved through rooms like smoke. Giancana, he was fire. And fire drew attention. Too much. FBI heat started to return. Vegas was now crawling with federal eyes. Names that had stayed buried were now showing up in wiretaps. And the worst part? Some of the guys liked it. They liked the fame. They liked the power that came with being feared on the front page. Tony saw it for what it was, a slow death. So he did what he always did. He watched, he waited, and when the moment came, he cleaned house. The break with Giancana didn't come with a gun. Not at first. Tony played it smart. He knew the outfit was still strong, but public heat could break even the tightest machine. He couldn't afford a war. So instead, he worked in the shadows. He isolated Giancana, cut off his influence, moved loyal men into place around him. Bit by bit, Giancana's power was drained like blood from a vein. Eventually, the feds arrested him. He got locked up. Then he fled to Mexico. The press called it exile. Tony called it a correction. But he knew it wouldn't last. Giancana was too wild to stay away. Sure enough, when he came back to Chicago in 1975, he was different, older, but still stupid, still running his mouth, still trying to act like a boss. Tony didn't even flinch. Giancana got a phone call one night, an old friend, dinner invite. Just talk. He was found the next morning in his basement kitchen, 7 bullets to the head and neck, a plate of sausage and peppers still warm on the table. It wasn't rage, it wasn't revenge, it was maintenance. Tony Accardo didn't let problems grow old, but Giancana wasn't the only one. The outfit had cracks in its floorboards, small at first, a guy getting too greedy here, a bad partner deal there, but the cracks led somewhere, to Vegas. Tony had always known that Vegas was a double-edged blade. Done right, it was a gold mine. Done wrong, it brought cameras, agents, rats, and the man holding the blade the wrong way, Tony Spilotro. They called him the Ant, short, mean, paranoid, the kind of guy who smiled like a wolf, but only when he was about to bite. He'd grown up in Chicago, knew the streets, knew the life. But unlike Accardo, Spilotro didn't believe in rules. He believed in fear. At first, Tony let it slide. Spilotro was there to protect the outfit's interests in Vegas, make sure no one skimmed off the skim, watch the books, keep the casinos honest. But Spilotro couldn't help himself. He wanted more. He formed a crew, the hole in the wall. Gang. Started pulling burglaries, jewelry store hits, safe jobs, not for the outfit, for himself. Like some street punk looking to make a name. He thought Vegas was his playground. Tony saw it differently. Vegas wasn't a playground. It was a bank, a business, and Spilotro was robbing from it. Worse, he was drawing attention. Feds started circling like buzzards. Casinos were getting spooked. Names were being leaked. A few low-level guys flipped, and suddenly Spilotro's name was showing up in depositions and court docs. And with it, Tony's. Not directly, but close enough to smell smoke. And Tony didn't let fire spread. The problem with Spilotro wasn't just the crime. It was the disrespect. He thought he could operate like the old days. Wild, unchecked, no rules. But he wasn't smart enough to hide it. He didn't realize who he was disrespecting. One night, in private, Tony looked across the table at his inner circle. guys who'd been with him since before the skimming, before Vegas, before the houses in River Forest. He said one thing: handle it. No name, no rant, just that. And they knew. It took time. You don't whack a guy like Spilotro without precision. He had heat on him, FBI tails, eyes on his every move. But Tony's crew? They had patience. In 1986, Spilotro and his brother were summoned. Some say it was a sit-down. Others say it was a hit disguised as peace. Either way, they never made it out. They were found buried in an Indiana cornfield, beaten to death, buried alive, some said. Tony never spoke on it, never confirmed, never denied. But everyone knew. The outfit didn't tolerate disobedience, not under Joe Batters. That was Tony's final real play. Not because he couldn't keep going, but because he didn't have to. After the Giancana fallout, after Spilotro was removed, after the casinos were cleaned up, Tony did something almost no boss ever got to do. He stepped back. Really stepped back. Let guys like Ayupa and Cerrone run the day-to-day. He still watched, still listened, still made the big calls when needed. But mostly, he lived. Played with his grandkids, walked the same streets, ate at the same restaurants, slept in the same house he'd owned for decades. He didn't chase the spotlight. He walked into the quiet. But the funny thing is, even as he stepped away, the power didn't leave him. It just followed at a distance, because nobody forgot who built the machine. Nobody forgot the baseball bat, the sausage and peppers, the cornfield. Nobody forgot that when Tony Accardo looked at you and didn't speak, your life changed. Sometimes for better, sometimes for much, much worse. By the time the 1980s rolled in, most of Tony Accardo's peers were either dead, in prison, or forgotten. Not Tony. He was still in the same house in River Forest, walking the same path to the driveway, watering the same rose bushes. The local paper called him a retired businessman. Neighbors called him polite and quiet. Some even waved when he drove past in his Buick. They didn't see the men who still came to his back door. They didn't hear the conversations held in his basement, beneath the low hum of an old refrigerator. And they never asked why Tony's house still had round-the-clock surveillance from the FBI. 2 cars parked down the street, agents taking turns with binoculars, watching a man who hadn't pulled a trigger in 40 years. But that's the thing with Accardo. He didn't have to pull the trigger. He just had to nod. The outfit had changed. It had grown up, and it had started to rot. The skimming operation in Las Vegas, the one Accardo had helped build with precision and discipline, was under fire. The FBI had cracked it open with a combination of wiretaps, turncoats, and cooperation deals from guys who used to swear they'd never talk. And now they were talking too much. Testimony started piling up. Names were named, dates, money transfers, bodies, and through all of it, the investigators were trying to get to one name: Tony Accardo. He was the white whale, the ghost they could never touch. They thought they had him in 1983. A massive federal investigation tied to the Las Vegas casino skimming operations resulted in indictments against several high-ranking members of the Chicago outfit, including men directly tied to Accardo. The case looked strong. The evidence was real. Money trails, hidden ledgers, whispers that Tony had been the silent architect behind the whole thing. But here's the difference between Tony and the rest. He never wrote a thing down. He never made the call himself. He never said more than he needed to. The indictment was serious. The feds called him a senior advisor to a national crime syndicate. They said he controlled everything, from Teamsters loans to the exact percentages skimmed off every blackjack table in Vegas. But when the trial came, Accardo sat in court like a retired accountant, calm, polite, old but clear. His defense was simple: I'm not a criminal, I'm a grandfather. And somehow, it worked. The case collapsed on procedural grounds. Evidence tossed, witness recanted. A few others mysteriously disappeared before trial. One by one, the walls fell. And Tony walked free. Again. No charges stuck, not a day behind bars, just like every other time. By now, he was a legend, but not the kind they make movies about. He wasn't Scarface. He wasn't flashy like Bugsy Siegel or loud like Gotti. He didn't crave headlines or club lights or power for the sake of power. He craved control. And that's why he never fell. Because Tony Accardo wasn't just a mob boss. He was the blueprint for how to survive it. He once told a younger associate, someone who asked him how he made it through so many years without catching a real case, something that stuck. Talkers die, watchers live. Simple as that. He didn't explain further. He didn't have to. The kid never asked another question. Meanwhile, the outfit was starting to crack under its own weight. RICO laws had changed everything. Now the feds could connect you to a conspiracy without needing to prove your hands were dirty. All they needed was a pattern, a structure, a family. And the outfit had a clear one. By the late 1980s, federal agents were dragging in dozens of made guys and associates, men who'd once sat at Tony's table, men who'd once begged for his blessing to open a gambling route or squeeze a trucking company for kickbacks. Now they were flipping, one by one, pleading guilty, naming names, trading years for their lives. Tony watched it happen with the kind of expression you'd expect from someone watching a dog grow old and sick. Not angry, not sad, just inevitable. He'd always known it couldn't last forever, not in the way it was built. Too many mouths, too many egos, too many who forgot that the power wasn't in the money, it was in the discipline. The outfit had been run like a business under Tony, but businesses become bloated, and eventually they eat themselves. That's what was happening now. And yet, he remained untouched, because he didn't talk, and because too many of the men who did talk were either already dead or still scared enough to leave his name out of it. There was one final scare in the early 1990s. A federal prosecutor tried to link him to an unsolved murder from 1959, a union man who'd gone missing after refusing to play ball. The theory was that Tony had ordered the hit himself. No middleman. Just a personal job, done for honor, not business. It was weak. But the prosecutor pushed it, had press conferences, claimed he was going to finally bring down Big Tuna. Tony didn't blink. He never even hired a new lawyer. And once again, the case dissolved. Witness died. No new evidence, old rumors, no proof. And the prosecutor? He lost his career over it. That was the thing with Accardo. You could chase him for 60 years, but you'd never catch him. Because by the time you arrived, the footprints were already covered, the money was already cleaned, and the silence had already buried the truth. In the last years of his life, Tony slowed down, but only on the outside. He stopped going out much, spent more time with his family, golfed, cooked, and every once in a while, he'd have a quiet meal with a few men, always older, always respectful. They'd speak in vague terms, no plans, just memory. And the one thing every man at that table knew was this. They were sitting with the last of a dying breed, not a gangster, not a killer, but a king who never had to raise his voice to rule. Tony Accardo died on May 22, 1992, natural causes, at home, surrounded by family, not in handcuffs, not on the run, not in some ditch off a back road in Indiana, in his bed, peaceful. The way every man in that life wished they could go out, but almost none ever did. The press called him the Quiet Don. The FBI called him the most successful criminal in U.S. history. But the men who really knew him, they never called him anything but one name, Joe Batters. Because they remembered the kid with the bat, and they remembered how far silence could take a man who never asked for respect, but took it anyway. Part 7 will explore Tony's legacy, not just in Chicago, but across the entire structure of modern organized. When Tony Accardo died in 1992, something shifted. Not in the headlines. The newspapers barely scratched the surface. They called him the Quiet Don, a relic. A figure from the golden age of organized crime. Most of the reporters didn't even understand who they were writing about. They just knew his name had popped up a few times over the years, always followed by words like allegedly, suspected, rumored. But in certain circles, in the booths of old Italian restaurants, in union halls, in the quiet corners of Vegas backrooms, men paused. Not out of grief, out of understanding. Because when Tony Accardo died, the world lost the last true architect of the American underworld. Not a loudmouth, not a gangster chasing cameras, not a sociopath swinging pistols in the street. A machine, built from patience, silence, and an absolute belief in control. And after he was gone, nothing worked quite the same again. The Chicago outfit didn't crumble overnight. These organizations are like rivers. They change course, they flood, they dry out, but they don't vanish all at once. Not when there's still money to move, still union contracts to rig, still doors that open when the right name is whispered. But without Tony, there were no more lines in the sand. He wasn't just a boss. He was the code, the unwritten rule book. He didn't need to enforce it anymore. He'd become it. You didn't break certain rules because Tony wouldn't have allowed it, even if Tony had been retired for years. His death was like the last nail pulled from a load-bearing wall. The structure still stood, but it groaned in the wind now. Men started testing the old ways. A few local crews got bold, tried pushing past the limits Tony had always kept firm. Street-level drug sales, sloppy intimidation tactics, even talking to people they shouldn't. It didn't go unnoticed, but unlike before, there was no Tony to call, no silent nod to course correct. Now, there were committees, votes, confusion, and in that confusion, the cracks widened. Law enforcement noticed the shift almost immediately. In the years after Accardo's death, indictments started rolling in again. RICO cases began to stick. More men flipped. Turncoats who'd once sworn they'd take their secrets to the grave now sang for lighter sentences. And why not? The man who once made those vows mean something, who made you fear disappointing him more than dying, was gone. Tony never trusted too many people, never opened the gates too wide. He knew what greed did to men who didn't have discipline. That's why he always kept his circle small. That's why he always kept his name off the paper. But the new generation? They wanted their piece of the empire, and they wanted it fast. They didn't understand the long game. They didn't understand that power wasn't about volume or flash or headlines. Power was about never being in the picture at all. Tony had taught that, lived it, perfected it, and without him, the outfit forgot. The decline of the Chicago outfit wasn't theatrical. There weren't massive shootouts or mafia wars on the street. It didn't explode. It eroded. Bit by bit, its influence shrank. Unions were modernized, politicized. The mob couldn't control them the way it once did. Casinos grew more corporate. The days of skimming envelopes off the top were replaced by surveillance cameras and audit trails. Las Vegas didn't belong to Chicago anymore. The neighborhoods changed too. New communities moved in. Old bloodlines moved out. The silence that once protected the outfit was replaced with smartphones, security systems, and a younger generation that didn't respect the old names. They didn't fear the outfit anymore, not like they feared Joe Batters. But Accardo's legacy didn't vanish. It transformed. See, in the bones of every modern organized crime ring, whether it's Italian, Russian, Armenian, or cartel, there are pieces of Tony's playbook. They learned from him. They studied the way he insulated himself from the product, from the cash, from the noise. They learned the value of front companies, of trustworthy men in places of power, of keeping your mouth shut, not just when arrested, but always. Tony turned organized crime from a street hustle into an invisible empire. And though the empire he built started to crumble, the design lived on. In law enforcement circles, his name still carries weight. Retired agents talk about him with a strange kind of respect, not admiration, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement. One FBI supervisor once said, "We never caught him because he never slipped. It wasn't that he got lucky, it's that he was better than we were." They never found wiretaps, never caught a conversation out of place, never found a paper trail leading directly to him. Because he knew. Long before anyone else, he knew where the wires were. He knew who the informants were. He knew how much you could skim before you got noticed. He played chess while everyone else played dice. His family stayed mostly clean, at least publicly. He raised his children away from the street life, gave them legitimate paths, real homes, education, safety. But even that was strategic. Tony didn't want his name to live on through violence. He didn't want his grandson sitting at poker tables with guns in their belts. He wanted them free. Because he knew in the end, you don't escape the life through bullets or lawyers. You escape through distance, and he created that distance for his bloodline, if not for himself. There's a statue in Chicago's Little Italy, not of Tony, of course. He wouldn't have wanted that. But nearby, in the old joints where guys used to meet over espresso and folded newspapers, you'll still hear stories. A man who remembered carrying an envelope up to Tony's house in '74. A guy who swore he saw Tony sitting in the corner of a steakhouse in '82, saying nothing, just watching. They all remember the eyes, the quiet way he sized you up, like he could read your whole soul before you said a word. That was what stayed with people. Not the hits, not the money, the discipline. The fact that Tony Accardo never looked over his shoulder, not once, because he never gave anyone a reason to follow him. The outfit still exists, technically. Smaller, quieter, a whisper of what it was. But it doesn't move like it used to. It doesn't inspire fear the same way. Because the last man who knew how to rule without noise is buried 6 feet under in a cemetery outside Chicago. And they don't make them like that anymore. Tony Joe Batters Accardo lived through the entire arc of American organized crime, from street-level bootlegging to a billion-dollar empire, from baseball bats in warehouses to billion-dollar casinos, from the blood-soaked rise of Capone to the sterile courtrooms of the 1990s, and somehow, he came out clean. Not because he was innocent, but because he understood the weight of silence. There's a question that's quietly passed around in law enforcement circles, in prison yards, and inside dimly lit back rooms where old gangsters still nurse espresso like it's communion wine. Why didn't Accardo ever crack? Why didn't he snap like Gotti, seeking glory? Why didn't he slip like Capone, too proud to hide? Why didn't he die young like so many of the men he helped bury? What made Tony Accardo different wasn't just luck. It wasn't even fear. Not exactly. It was something colder, deeper, more calculated. It was discipline. From the outside, Tony's rise looked simple. A smart, silent enforcer who learned fast, kept quiet, and waited his turn. But inside, there was nothing simple about the way he thought. He never acted on emotion, never made a move unless it was absolutely necessary, never opened his mouth just to fill silence. If you said something to Accardo, you better mean every word. Because if it was wrong, you weren't just incorrect. You were disrespecting his time. And disrespect was the closest thing to a trigger he had. Some men crave chaos. They love the storm. Tony didn't. Tony was the eye of the storm, where everything is still, but if you step too far in any direction, you get torn apart. That's how he trained his mind. He was never drunk in public, never brought women around the business, never showed off. Never flashed wealth, not because he was humble, but because he understood the cost of being seen. He watched Capone burn under the weight of his own shadow. Tony learned early that if the public knows your name, so do the feds, so do the snitches, so do the greedy ones. He wasn't going to make that mistake. He also understood psychology, long before it was fashionable for criminals to act like chess players. He studied people like a hunter studies wind. He knew when a man was lying. Not from what he said, but how his shoulders sat. He knew when a man was getting soft from how he parked his car or how late he showed up. Tony saw weakness in the tiny, quiet ways. And if you were on his payroll and that weakness became a threat, you didn't get a warning. You got replaced. Efficiently. Quietly. The only people who knew you were gone were the ones smart enough not to ask why. His silence wasn't just a strategy. It was armor. He didn't just avoid headlines. He avoided words altogether. He'd walk into meetings and sit through them saying almost nothing. But his presence alone made grown men stutter. They didn't fear what he'd say. They feared what he was thinking. And that fear, that was power. Because when a man like Tony listens, really listens, you start to question every word coming out of your own mouth. That's how he kept people loyal. not by shouting, threatening, or bribing, by forcing them to feel their own nervousness in his silence. There was one story, whispered among older outfit guys, about a sit-down in the mid-60s. A young capo from the East Coast had flown in, cocky, full of himself. He started running his mouth at the table, talking numbers, power, even cracking jokes about old men still running the show. Tony just stared at him, said nothing, didn't blink. When the guy finished, Tony nodded once, stood up, and left the room. Said nothing to anyone. Didn't even finish his drink. 2 weeks later, the kid's casino investment deal fell apart. Then, his loan sharking operation got hit with a sudden tax investigation. Then, a body turned up in Queens, someone close to him. Nothing linked back to Tony, not a phone call, not a paper trail, not even a threat. But the kid vanished from the scene after that. Disgraced, done. And everyone else at that meeting? They never joked again. Tony believed in hierarchy. You didn't skip the chain of command. You didn't play both sides. You didn't bring heat to the door. He didn't care if you were smart. He didn't care if you made money. He cared if you respected the structure, because without structure, the whole empire crumbles. He watched other bosses, from New York to New Orleans, lose control of their crews because they ran things like families instead of businesses. Tony didn't believe in brotherhood. He believed in results. And if your emotions got in the way of those results, you were already a liability. That cold logic made him a dangerous man, but also a necessary one. Chicago was never the bloodiest mob city. It didn't need to be. Tony made sure the outfit operated like a company. Revenue streams, gambling, unions, loans, overhead, bribes, lawyers, silence, risk management, surveillance, rotation of soldiers, regular cleanups, exit strategy, plausible deniability, limited paper, early retirements. He even kept a mental scoreboard, a running list of who owed him, who disappointed him, and who was likely to become a problem. And when someone fell into the wrong column, he didn't wait for proof. He didn't give second chances. He cleaned the slate. Even in his private life, Accardo was deliberate. He kept a small circle, trusted only a handful of men, never let his wife or children near the business. He didn't confide, didn't vent, didn't philosophize about morality. His friends say he was polite, even warm when it mattered, but you could never reach him. Not all the way, not the real part. That part stayed hidden, locked behind eyes that had seen too much and still managed not to blink. If there was any weakness in Tony Accardo, it wasn't pride or greed. It was the price of carrying that much control for that long. He aged slowly, but the weight wore him down. In his final years, he rarely spoke of the old days, not because he was guilty, because he was finished. He'd won the game. And men who win that big don't need to relive it. They just watch the next generation fumble the ball. Some say Tony never slept well, that the ghosts of those he gave orders on haunted him in the dark. But those who knew him, really knew him, say that's just myth. Tony slept fine, because Tony believed in what he built. And he believed that those who died under his rule weren't innocent men. They were mistakes. And Tony didn't mourn mistakes. He corrected them. Tony Accardo's mind was a vault. You could push against it for a lifetime and never hear an echo. That's what kept him alive. That's what built the outfit. That's what made him the last man standing in a world where even loyalty had an expiration date. When a man like Tony Accardo dies, the first thing to go is not the money, not the fear, and not even the power. It's the balance. For more than 5 decades, Tony had kept the Chicago outfit on a razor's edge, ruthless but restrained, dangerous but never sloppy. He made sure every move was calculated, every word weighted, every decision final. But after May 1992, that control vanished. And for the first time in a long time, Chicago's streets tasted chaos again. You'd think by now the outfit would have evolved, that Tony's lessons were drilled deep enough into the structure to outlive the man. But the truth is, Tony had been the structure. He didn't just build the house, he was the load-bearing wall. Without him, everything stood crooked. In the weeks after his funeral, there was no war, no explosions, no immediate fall. There was something worse. Indecision. Who was in charge? Jackie Cerrone, Joey Aiuppa, Vincent Solano. All of them had once served Tony's command, each with strengths, each with flaws. But none of them had the weight. None had Tony's silence, his calm, his ability to terrify a man without saying a word. They all talked too much. They all wanted just a little too much. And that was how the outfit began to fracture. The street-level guys felt it first. Bookmakers noticed their protection payments weren't getting picked up as fast. Some union reps were getting pressure from other cities, from New York, from Detroit, asking if Chicago was still in control. Even in Vegas, whispers started flying. Word was the old man was gone, and that meant the skim might loosen up. That someone else might try to claim a bigger cut. Tony had always kept the vultures at bay. Now they started circling. Meanwhile, the FBI didn't waste a second. They'd watched Tony for decades. They couldn't touch him, but they studied him, and they understood what most street cops didn't. Tony wasn't just the top guy, he was the glue. And they knew the outfit without him would bleed itself open. Federal agents intensified their surveillance. Old names were subpoenaed. Cold cases were reopened. Guys who'd once sat comfortably under Tony's protection were suddenly getting knocks on their doors at 6 a.m. with warrants in hand. Most of them cracked fast. Because under Tony, you kept quiet. Because you feared what he'd do. But now, they feared the government more than they feared the outfit. And that shift, that slow drift in fear, is what dismantles empires. The first high-profile arrest after Tony's death hit in 1993. Sam Carlisi, a man who had once acted as front boss during Tony's semi-retirement, was picked up on racketeering and murder conspiracy. Carlisi had been steady, even respected, but without Tony's oversight, his operation became loose. Too many moving parts, too many liabilities. The trial dragged on, but the message was clear. The feds smelled blood. They were coming, not just for the soldiers, but for the structure, and they weren't pulling punches. Back on the street, the old codes began to erode. You started hearing things you never would have heard under Tony. A guy bragging about what crew he was with, another throwing cash around like he was untouchable. Some wise guys getting into drugs again, a line Tony had kept cold for decades. The outfit wasn't dead, but it was sick. You could feel it. A rot in the bones, a shift from discipline to indulgence, from strategy to desperation. There was one man who tried to hold the line, John No-Nose DeFranzo. He stepped up in the late 90s, hoping to stabilize the outfit. A smart guy, old school in a way, respected enough to keep the crews somewhat in order. But he wasn't Tony. He didn't command the same fear. He didn't have the same restraint. He did what he could, kept operations low-key, focused on gambling, loans, trucking, but he had to deal with an outfit that had become cluttered with loose ends. Young guys who'd never known Tony, old guys trying to grab a final piece, and feds waiting for any mistake to swing the hammer down. And swing it did. In 2005, the FBI launched the biggest organized crime prosecution in Chicago history, Operation Family Secrets. It hit like a bomb. This wasn't just about rackets. This was about murder. The indictment listed 18 killings spanning from 1970 to 1986, all tied to the Chicago outfit. Most of these hits happened during Tony's reign, but now, decades later, the past was knocking on the door. Some of the names charged were the same guys who had once been Tony's soldiers, men who'd sat at his table, men who had carried out hits with his nod. And now, they were being paraded in front of cameras, shackled and hollow-eyed. The government had a secret weapon, Frank Calabrese Jr. The son of a top outfit enforcer, Frank Jr. turned informant and secretly recorded conversations with his father while both were in prison. It was the kind of betrayal that would have meant certain death under Tony. But now, Frank Calabrese Sr. stood in court, staring across at his own blood, caught between hate and disbelief, and behind him, the rest of the outfit sat in stunned silence. The trial tore through Chicago like wildfire. Mob funerals stopped happening in public. Old associates deleted each other's phone numbers. Restaurants that once buzzed with quiet deals became ghost towns. Tony's empire had become a crime scene. And yet, through all of this, no one blamed Tony. Even as the outfit collapsed under its own weight, even as informants named names and buried secrets rose from the dead, no one ever dared say, Tony built this mess. Because he hadn't. He built something clean by dirty standards. He built it with rules, with discipline, with silence. It was the men who came after that forgot. The legacy of Tony Accardo isn't just that he ran the outfit longer than anyone else. It's that after he left, the whole thing forgot how to exist. They remembered the money, the fear, the prestige, but they forgot the quiet. They forgot that Tony didn't just kill men, he killed disorder. And once he was gone, disorder came back with a vengeance. You can walk down Taylor Street today, in the old Little Italy section of Chicago. You'll see families walking dogs, students grabbing coffee, new condos where old mob-owned storefronts used to sit. But if you ask the right old-timer at the corner bakery, the guy with the tired eyes and the scar on his lip, he'll tell you, things ain't been the same since Joe Batters left. And he won't say it like a joke. He'll say it like a warning. Because Tony's name didn't fade. It became the line between the old world and the new. The thing about Tony Accardo was this. He didn't just build a criminal empire. He built a psychological cage around every man who ever worked for him. Even long after he was gone, his name echoed, not in the streets, but in the minds of men who'd once answered to him. You could hear it in their voices, older now, hunched with age, tired from years of pretending they weren't afraid anymore. But they were. Because when you served under Tony Joe Batters Accardo, fear wasn't something you ran from. It became part of your blood. He didn't yell, didn't break glasses or smash tables, didn't make examples in public. He did worse. He'd look at you, really look. And in that silence, you'd start second-guessing everything. Not just what you said, but what you meant, what you thought, what you might do in the future, and whether he could already see it in your face. He made you aware of your own heartbeat. That kind of control didn't vanish when the money was gone. It didn't leave when the lawyers came knocking. It stayed. There were guys who walked away clean from the outfit. No indictments, no murders, no prison time. They got out, raised families, started legit businesses, built restaurants, bars, auto shops. But if you sat across from them years later, asked the wrong question, mentioned the wrong name, you'd see something strange behind their eyes. A flicker, a pause, that half-second of Tony's shadow returning. Like a ghost you were never allowed to talk about. One guy, a bookmaker, mid-level, ran a numbers racket on the north side during Tony's reign. Retired now, lives in Arizona, has grandkids, doesn't drink anymore. He once said something over coffee that stuck. Tony never said more than he had to. But when he did, it felt like you were standing on a trap door. You didn't know if it was locked or if it was already opening. That's what haunted people. Not what Tony did, but what he might have done if you made the wrong move. The outfit wasn't built like a gang. It was built like a temple. Every man who worked in it didn't just carry orders. He carried guilt, even if he'd never pulled a trigger. Because Tony didn't recruit wild dogs. He recruited men who knew how to hold their breath for years, sometimes decades, waiting for instructions that might never come. And if you got called into a room with Tony, that meant one of two things. 1, you were being rewarded. 2, or you were being judged. And Tony never explained which one it was. Not until it was too late. Some of his closest men went to prison after he died. Not because he abandoned them. He didn't. They went down because they couldn't operate without him. Tony was the compass. He made sure every decision passed through a filter of logic, calm, and precision. Without that, men got nervous, and in the mob, nervous men die first. There was an older soldier, known only by his nickname, Mick. He never made headlines, never wore flashy suits. He once spent 6 years in Joliet and never flipped. When he got out, he disappeared, bought a small home near Lake Geneva, lived quiet, clean, Someone once asked him why he didn't turn witness like the others. He didn't hesitate. "I'd rather face God than disappoint Joe Batters." That wasn't hyperbole. That was faith. Twisted, sure, but real. The emotional toll wasn't just on the men, it seeped into their families. Wives who learned not to ask questions, kids who grew up with two fathers, the one who smiled at dinner and the one who came home silent after a meeting. Women who knew something was wrong but could never prove it, and eventually stopped trying. That's the thing about Tony. He didn't just rule a city, he infected generations with the weight of unspoken rules. There's a type of trauma that doesn't come from violence, it comes from waiting for it. Living every day like something might go wrong, and if it did, no one would warn you. That's how Tony operated. You never saw it coming. And that made the silence even louder. A former Chicago detective once said, "What Accardo did was worse than fear. He made men think twice about their own instincts. He rewired them. If a guy had a bad feeling about something, he didn't trust it. He waited to see if Accardo agreed. That's not just control. That's possession." And yet, many of those same men respected him more than anyone in their lives. Some loved him, not in a sentimental way, not like a father, but like a god. Because Tony did something almost no one else in that world ever did. He kept his word. If he told you you were safe, you were. If he told you your time was up, he didn't lie about it. There were no games, just finality. But the cost of that consistency was a trail of men walking the earth like ghosts, survivors of a code so strict, so controlled, that even freedom felt like a leash. Years after his death, one of his old lieutenants, retired, living in Florida, pretending to be just another retired guy on a boat, was asked in a private interview how he felt about Tony's passing. The man didn't answer for a long time. Then he lit a cigarette, looked out at the water, and said, "There was peace when he was alive. You didn't understand it until it was gone. But yeah, there was peace." He wasn't talking about the streets, he was talking about himself. Because living under Tony meant you didn't have to think. You just followed. You slept at night because you knew someone else was thinking 10 steps ahead, keeping it all in line. And when that presence disappeared, you were left alone. And alone, for the first time in decades, you realized what fear really was. The men who lived under Tony Accardo didn't just serve a boss, they served a philosophy, one built on discipline over desire, silence over ego, control over chaos. And when that philosophy died, so did their ability to function in a world full of men who had no idea what it cost to keep a criminal empire from eating itself alive. There's a kind of rage that builds in lawmen, not the rage that comes from danger or bullets, but the kind that grows from knowing someone is guilty and not being able to prove it. Tony Accardo wasn't just the Chicago outfit's backbone. To the FBI, he was a mirage, always there, always untouchable, always just out of reach. And the worst part? He knew they were chasing him, and he didn't care. Most criminals crack. They talk too much. They show off. They screw up because they're human, flawed, greedy, arrogant. That's what made Tony a nightmare. He didn't make noise, didn't leave fingerprints, didn't need to show off. He was bulletproof, not because he dodged charges, but because the charges never had enough oxygen to catch fire. You could feel his presence in every major investigation. But when the evidence was tallied, he was never in the room. FBI Special Agent Bill Romer spent most of his career trying to crack the Chicago outfit. Smart guy, straight-laced, believed in justice like it was religion. He wrote about Accardo years later, called him the most intelligent and ruthless gangster he ever pursued, and Romer chased dozens. But Accardo, he was different. Romer's team would stake out Tony's house for days, freezing in unmarked vans, watching him pull weeds in the garden or wave to his mailman like a retiree. They tapped phones, watched bank accounts, flipped guys left and right, and still nothing. No wiretap ever caught Tony talking business, no ledger had his name, no hit could be traced to his say-so. Romer once said, He committed more murders by his orders than Capone ever did personally, and he never got caught for one of them. And that burned. Because here's the truth. Law enforcement loves a loud criminal. Give them a bragger, a hothead, someone who likes the camera, and they'll bury him. But a man like Tony, he was worse than slippery. He was still. And that stillness drove investigators to the edge. They'd pull in one of his guys, a soldier, a runner, a skimmer, and beat them with questions. But every time Tony's name came up, there was hesitation. Not just fear of getting whacked, fear of being wrong, because saying Tony gave the order wasn't just dangerous. It meant you'd better be sure, or you'd end up with more than perjury charges. You might just disappear. And then there was the problem of the people. The public didn't hate Accardo the way they hated Capone or Gotti. Why? Because Tony didn't make enemies outside the life. He didn't kill cops, didn't terrorize neighborhoods, didn't extort small businesses or mug grandmothers. He ran his empire quietly, from the shadows. He kept the chaos contained, and to the average person on the street, he was just another old Italian man with a nice lawn and quiet shoes. Even some of the local cops respected him, if not for what he did, then for how he did it. They'd lock up some loudmouth thug running drugs, then drive past Tony's house and see him sipping coffee in the garden. And somewhere, deep down, even the badgemen had to admit, the city was calmer when he was in charge, but the feds didn't care about calm. They cared about control. And Tony had too much of it. Every attempt to build a case became an exercise in frustration. Here's how it usually went. 1. An informant would swear they had dirt on Accardo. 2. The feds would listen, build wiretaps, shadow known associates. 3. They'd collect hours of tape, all clean. 4. Then the informant would vanish, recant, or die. One veteran agent called him the ghost in the war room. His face was on every board, his name circled in red. But his files, thin, always thin. Operation Pendorf in the 1970s tried to nail him. The name itself stood for Penetrate the Chicago Outfit. They ran it for 4 years. And what did they get? A handful of small-time convictions, a few drug busts, and a deeper appreciation for how clean Tony kept his hands. Even when they caught men like Sam Giancana, Joey Aiupa, and Tony Spilotro, all guys who worked under Accardo, none of them could pin anything on the old man. Not because they didn't want to, but because he never gave them anything to use. He'd taught them to fear information. One young prosecutor in the early 80s, part of a task force trying to link Accardo to the Teamsters pension scandal, spent months combing through bank transfers and business records. He found money, he found shells, but he never found Tony. One night, while reviewing wire transcripts at 2 a.m., he slammed the papers on his desk and said, "It's like trying to catch fog with a fork." That line got passed around the office, became a kind of joke. But behind it, there was defeat. Even RICO, the most powerful weapon in the DOJ's arsenal, couldn't nail him, not directly. They used it to take down bosses in New York. They used it to dismantle entire families. They used it to bring whole empires to their knees, but not his. Because RICO works best when people talk, and under Accardo, people learned to live with silence, even if it killed them. When Tony died in 1992, there were agents still on the clock who'd been trying to charge him since the late 50s. They read the news in silence, no trial, no deathbed confession, no wiretap bombshell. Just a clean, quiet passing in his own home, in his own bed, surrounded by family. No handcuffs, no justice, just silence. One agent, retired by then, drove out to the cemetery a week later, stood at the edge of the burial site, not close enough to be seen by mourners. He didn't bring flowers. He brought a copy of a report he'd written in 1966, laying out an ambitious plan to finally catch Tony Accardo in a money laundering trap. It never worked. He folded that report, tucked it into his coat, and walked away. Years later, he told a reporter, "I wasn't there to pay respects. I was there because I never got the last word." He did. That was Tony's ultimate victory. Not the money, not the empire, not even the blood he didn't have to spill. It was the fact that his enemies never got closure. They spent decades chasing a ghost who never slipped, who never let them feel the satisfaction of being right. Loyalty in the mob is usually described like love, something emotional, sacred, even poetic. But under Tony Accardo, it was something else entirely. It wasn't about brotherhood. It wasn't about blood oaths or teary-eyed speeches. It wasn't even about honor. It was about certainty. You knew where you stood with Accardo. You knew the rules. You knew the consequences. And in a world where most bosses were unpredictable, egotistical, or paranoid, that kind of clarity bred something more powerful than fear. It bred loyalty without question. Most men in organized crime serve a boss because they're scared to die. They obey out of survival. Tony didn't want men who obeyed. He wanted men who understood. If you sat at his table, he expected two things from you. 1, do your job. 2, don't embarrass the family. That's it. You didn't have to flatter him. You didn't have to kiss his ring or throw parties in his name. You just had to be dependable. And in return, Tony offered something rare in his line of work: stability. Guys who worked under Capone, they didn't know if they'd live through the week. Capone was flashy, emotional, volatile. He might throw a steak at you one night, then hug you the next. Men who worked for Gotti in New York said it was like being in a circus. Cameras, rats, egos clashing every day. But with Accardo, everything had rhythm. Meetings were short, decisions were final. And if you followed the rules, you were protected, truly protected. There was a guy in the 60s, a low-level courier. Nothing special. Got pinched with a bag full of betting slips and 10 grand in cash. Didn't flip, didn't talk. Served 18 months and walked out with his mouth still shut. When he got out, there was no parade, no welcome party, just a phone call. A voice told him to be at a house in Oak Brook the next morning. He showed up. Tony was there, alone. Sat the kid down. Didn't ask what happened in jail. Didn't give a speech. He handed him an envelope and said, "You did your job. Now do something smarter with your life." The kid left Chicago 2 weeks later. Bought a gas station in Arizona. Never saw a courtroom again. But every Christmas for the next 20 years, a package showed up at that gas station from Chicago. Same handwriting, no name. Inside was a holiday card and 10 crisp $100 bills. That's how Accardo rewarded loyalty. Not with flash, but with memory. And that memory went both ways. You crossed Tony once? He didn't forget. But if you stood tall, even just once, he'd carry that with him. Maybe not forever, but long enough to matter. That's why so few men ever flipped on him, even when they had the chance. Even when they had nothing left to lose. Because somewhere in the back of their minds, they remembered the time Tony paid for their kid's surgery, or helped bury their brother, or made a call that kept their name off a list. Tony never asked for loyalty. He earned it, transaction by transaction, and he never broke his end of the deal. Not once. In the 70s, when the outfit started reaching deeper into Las Vegas, a few of the younger guys tried pushing their own rackets. They wanted to run clubs, use casino girls for escort rings, dip into narcotics, quick money, flashy money. Tony heard about it, but he didn't fly out to Vegas. He didn't send threats. He invited the ringleader back to Chicago. No yelling, no slaps, no bat, just a talk. Tony told the kid, "This isn't about greed, this is about trust. You take fast money, you bring fast heat, and I'm not going to jail because you don't know how to slow down." A week later, that entire Vegas crew was dissolved, not killed, just reassigned, silenced, moved, forgotten, because Tony didn't punish to make a point. He corrected to preserve the order. That was the foundation of loyalty in Tony's world. Not emotion, not fear, but function. You followed him because things worked under him. The machine ran, the money flowed, the books balanced, the bodies stayed buried. And men who value order, real order, stay loyal to the man who brings it. Another key to his loyalty was this: he never asked a man to do something he wouldn't have done himself. Tony wasn't soft, he killed, he enforced, he buried men with his own hands in the early years. So when he gave an order, it wasn't arrogance, it was continuation. You were stepping into his footprints, not following a fantasy. That difference mattered. Men die for legends, but they live for leaders. Even the few who did flip, they struggled with it. Guys like Nicholas Calabresi, who turned government witness during the Operation Family Secrets trial in the 2000s, never implicated Tony directly. Why? Because there was nothing to implicate. Tony had never spoken to them directly, never sent orders through obvious channels, never risked the chain. He respected the structure too much to make it personal. And because he did, the loyalty went both ways. But here's the real genius of Accardo's loyalty structure. It outlived him. Even after he died, men still measured their actions against what he would have done. You'd hear it in court transcripts. Joe Batters would have never allowed that. Accardo would have kept it clean. Tony would have shut this down before it started. He became a moral compass in a world built on immorality. Because he enforced a code that was simple enough to follow but strict enough to maintain order. And once that code faded, the outfit fell apart. Loyalty without structure is just hope. And in the mob, hope gets you dead. So when you talk about Tony Accardo's power, don't just look at the bodies. Look at the men who chose silence, chose obedience, chose to protect a man who never needed to ask. That's real loyalty. Not loud, not dramatic, not even emotional, just unshakable. They called them Tony's guys, not in the papers, not in court documents, but in whispers. You heard it at funerals, in back rooms of Italian clubs, or outside quiet diners at 3 a.m. A guy dies, heart attack, old age, cancer. And someone leans over and says, he was one of Joe Batters' guys, real outfit, old school. And that word, old school, it didn't mean romantic. It meant disciplined, sharp, useful. It meant the guy knew when to keep his mouth shut. It meant he understood that the outfit wasn't a gang or a crew or a club. It was a machine. And Tony had been the mechanic. But machines break down when you let the wrong hands near the engine. That's exactly what started happening in the late 1990s and into the early 2000s. The old names, Cerrone, Aiupa, Lombardo, DiFranzo, they were aging out, dying, or stepping so far back into the shadows they might as well have vanished. Most of them had one thing in common. They'd all worked under Tony. They'd all understood the code. And more importantly, they'd respected it, even if they disagreed with each other, even if they jostled for rank or territory. When it came to Tony's rules, they didn't argue. But once they were gone, the glue failed. What replaced Tony's generation wasn't another wave of soldiers molded in the same discipline. It was a void, a quiet panic. Younger guys, ambitious, aggressive, reckless, started slipping into positions of power. Some were family, some weren't. But most had never felt Tony's presence. They knew the legend, but they didn't know the standard. So they did what young, undisciplined men do when they get a taste of power. They acted like bosses instead of becoming them. You started seeing mistakes Tony would have never tolerated. Street-level drug deals, club shakedowns out in the open, phones being used for business, names being thrown around without caution, sloppy extortion attempts that drew heat instead of respect. Suddenly, guys were getting picked up for talking too much, not doing too much. That was the first real sign the outfit wasn't what it used to be. Under Tony, no one talked. Now, everyone was heard, on wires, in bars, in plea agreements. One example, Michael Fat Mike Sarno, not a nobody, grew up around the outfit, had ties, pulled weight. In the 2000s, he tried reviving some of the old gambling and extortion roots, tried running the game like it was still the 1970s. But the difference? He wasn't invisible. He used phones, talked to guys already on federal radar, and ran with people who didn't understand silence the way Tony's generation had. In 2009, Sarno was indicted, by 2010 convicted, not for a hit, not for racketeering on a massive scale, but for running a suburban burglary ring connected to illegal video poker machines. Tony would have laughed at the smallness of it, and then had the whole operation buried, but these were the new faces of the outfit, guys playing gangster without the playbook, The outfit didn't vanish overnight, but it shrank, fast. It wasn't fear keeping the cops away anymore. It was lack of relevance. The money was thinner, the leadership scattered, the streets louder and more dangerous, not because of organized crime, but because of unorganized crime. Tony's outfit had been quiet and bloody. The post-Tony outfit was loud and clumsy. Then came Operation Family Secrets, the final blow. In 2005, federal agents unsealed indictments connecting 14 murders to a handful of high-ranking outfit members, mostly stemming from the 1970s and 1980s. It was one of the biggest mob trials in American history, and it happened years after Tony was gone. But his ghost was still in the courtroom. Every testimony about a hit, every conversation about orders, every wiretap that got played, all of it led back to Tony's era. But not to Tony. Because even in death, he stayed clean. The men who were charged, most of them had been Tony's guys, but without him there to steer the ship, they'd slipped. One by one, they'd made small mistakes, trusting the wrong people, taking shortcuts, letting the past catch up. And the witnesses who finally cracked, family, blood, sons and brothers and cousins of the old guard, guys who never would have said a word when Tony was alive. But now, Tony was gone, and loyalty didn't mean what it used to. In some strange way, Tony's greatest strength, his total control, became the outfit's greatest weakness after his death, because no one had learned to lead. They'd learned to follow him. And when he was no longer there to follow, they tried to mimic his moves, but you can't imitate instinct. You either have the discipline or you don't, and most of them didn't. By 2010, the outfit wasn't extinct, but it was a shadow. The big crews were gone. The judges weren't being bought, the cops weren't afraid to knock on doors, and the younger guys, they were either doing small time, flipping to the feds, or skipping the mob life entirely for quicker, safer rackets, scams, fraud, pills, internet crime. The ceremony was dead. The structure collapsed, and all that remained was a name, the outfit, still whispered with a bit of weight, but not with fear. You still find guys who swear it's active, that there's a hidden boss, that things just went underground, that the outfit is just sleeping. Maybe. But it's not Tony's outfit. That died the day the last man who remembered Joe Batters' stare took his last breath. And that's the story of collapse. Not explosive, not cinematic, but slow, eroded by time, weakness, and the vacuum left behind when discipline exits the room. River Forest, Illinois, a neighborhood of trimmed hedges, quiet lawns, and brick homes that look nearly identical from the curb. You could drive through it a dozen times and never guess one of the most powerful mob bosses in American history was living behind a white garage door and a tidy front porch. That's exactly how Tony wanted it. His house wasn't a fortress, no armed guards, no concrete gates or pit bulls barking at the edge of the lawn. It was normal, at least on the outside. But inside was something else entirely. Tony was married to Clarice Porter, a Chicago girl, quiet, devout, Catholic, a woman who knew, without needing it spelled out, that silence was not just preferred, it was mandatory. They had 4 children, girls and boys, a family that lived in a kind of structured calm, the kind of environment where the air itself seemed trained not to rise above a certain volume. There were no screaming matches, no wild dinners, no laughing until midnight. Life in the Accardo house was measured, dignified, predictable, and if there was any tension, any fear, it never showed on the surface, but it lived in the spaces between words. The kids went to Catholic school. They dressed neatly, spoke politely, and followed the rules. Teachers said they were well-behaved, respectful, but also reserved. One nun once said, off record, they had the eyes of kids who already knew too much. They weren't abused. They weren't neglected. They were simply being raised by a man who commanded control in everything he touched. And that included his home. Tony didn't bring the business home. No sit-downs at the kitchen table. No wise guys walking through the living room. No envelopes exchanged under the stairs. If you came to talk business, you didn't step foot inside the house. He took you to a club, or a golf course, or one of the many nondescript buildings he kept just for meetings. He was never reckless. Not even once. To his neighbors, he was Anthony Accardo, friendly enough, mostly quiet. He paid his taxes, kept his lawn perfect, let his wife host modest dinners on holidays, always sent flowers when someone on the block passed away. The only thing off, no one ever really got close. Tony didn't smile often, even at home, not because he was angry, because he didn't have to. His kids learned early that love didn't come in hugs or bedtime stories. It came in stability, in being provided for, in not having to worry like other families did. They had food, education, safety, and they had rules. If one of the kids stayed out too late, there was no yelling. Tony would be sitting in the living room, lights off except for the lamp, reading, waiting. When they walked in, he wouldn't raise his voice. He wouldn't ask where they were. He'd just look at them, once, long enough, and that look, it said everything. He didn't slap. He didn't scream. He didn't need to. His authority in the home wasn't enforced with violence. It was enforced by stillness, by the absence of warmth. Because when a man like Tony gets disappointed in you, you feel it like gravity. The Accardo children lived quiet lives. None followed in their father's footsteps. That wasn't an option. Tony made that clear. He didn't want his sons or daughters near the business. He didn't raise successors. He raised citizens. They grew up and pursued normal careers. Law, business, teaching, nothing flashy, nothing that invited questions. And Tony made sure they had every resource to live clean, because he knew what kind of blood ran in their veins, and he was determined to keep them out of the mess he bathed in for decades. But there's something else that lives in children of powerful men, something you don't always see. It's not trauma, not in the traditional sense. It's unspoken pressure, the feeling that everything you do reflects back on the name, that any mistake is amplified, that your father's shadow is long and silent and heavy. Some of Tony's kids changed their names later in life, not to escape prosecution. They were never charged with anything, but to escape the legend. Because even clean hands feel dirty when the world whispers your last name like a warning. Clarice, Tony's wife, lived through it all. The Prohibition years, the Capone era, the outfit's golden age, the FBI cars parked across the street, the whispers at church, the reporters calling the house, the friends who stopped inviting her to brunch. She stayed by his side through every chapter. Why? Some said loyalty, some said fear, others said she simply understood the kind of man he was and never tried to change him. She kept her world small. Her conversations limited, her eyes down when needed. And in return, Tony never cheated, never left, never disrespected her. In a life built on betrayal, that says something. There's one story, unconfirmed, passed down through quiet channels, about Clarice walking into the kitchen one morning and finding Tony sitting at the table with a letter in his hand. He didn't look up, just handed her the envelope. Inside was a picture of their daughter, taken from a distance, a warning from a rival family, a reminder that no one was untouchable. Clarice didn't scream, didn't cry. She looked at her husband and said, "Handle it." And he did. Within a week, 3 men were found dead, 1 in a trunk, 1 in a motel room, 1 just missing. Tony never said another word about it, and neither did she. That was their marriage, not warm, not loud, but bonded by silence, respect, and an unspoken understanding of what kind of life they had chosen. Tony once told a close associate, "You don't bring dirt into the house. You bury it before you walk through the door." And he lived that way. He separated the man he was in the streets from the man he was at home, not because he was hiding, but because he refused to let the poison seep in. His grandkids knew a softer version. To them, he was Papa Tony. He bought them ice cream, took them fishing, slipped them $20 bills when their parents weren't looking. He never told them stories from the old days, never taught them how to throw a punch or use a knife. He taught them to respect time, to sit still, to look people in the eye when they talked. He wanted them to live in a world he could never touch, the one he built from the shadows but could never walk freely in. So who was Tony Accardo at home? He was a man who woke up early, read the paper from front to back, ate lunch at the same time every day, didn't tolerate noise, kept the thermostat exactly where he liked it, and never once mentioned the outfit in front of his children. To them, he was just dad. To Clarice, he was just her husband. And to himself, maybe just a man trying to control the only thing he truly loved, his peace. They say when you live your life in shadows, you either go out in fire or you go out in silence. Tony Accardo chose silence. It wasn't by accident. It wasn't weakness. It was the final move in a life that had been played like a master's game of chess, controlled, methodical, and always 3 steps ahead. He didn't want to die in a courtroom, didn't want to die behind bars, didn't want to be shot in the street like the bosses he'd outlived. He wanted to die the way he lived, untouched. In the late 1980s, Tony was in his 80s, still living in River Forest, same brick house, same trimmed lawn. His kids had grown. His grandkids were now visiting for Sunday dinners. The old phone calls had slowed. The envelopes had stopped coming. The men who once kissed his hand were now buried, locked up, or whispering into wiretaps. And Tony? He simply exhaled. He wasn't worried about going broke. He wasn't worried about being chased. He had outlasted everything, but outlasting everything comes with a cost. You start to feel the weight of time. His body, once solid and thick like a butcher's block, had grown thinner. The hands that once held a bat in a basement now trembled slightly when pouring wine. The steps down to the cellar took longer. The nights stretched out. His mind, still sharp, but not as fast. He started forgetting small things, dates, names of priests, which jacket he'd worn the day before. Not major slips, not at first, but Tony noticed. And that's what mattered. Because Tony Accardo wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of fading. He didn't talk about the old days. If a relative asked, he'd smile slightly, shake his head and say, that was someone else's life. He meant it. To him, the hits, the meetings, the violence, it wasn't nostalgia. It was completed work, nothing more. He didn't want to sit in a rocking chair reliving the glory days. He wanted peace. And yet, peace didn't come easily. There were nights when he'd sit on the back porch with a glass of scotch, staring out at the dark yard. You'd see it in his eyes. He was still playing the old game in his head. Still thinking, who flipped? Who talked? Who got sloppy? Who stayed loyal? He didn't write anything down, didn't keep journals, didn't confess. But in those long silences, Tony was doing what he had always done best, taking inventory. His wife, Clarice, had slowed down too. She spent most days reading, tending to her plants, cooking simple meals. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. There's something that happens when 2 people share a secret for 50 years. Not a moment, not a crime, but a life. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was earned. She knew the man sitting at her dinner table had ordered deaths. She knew their vacations were sometimes cover stories. She knew the nice suits and thick steaks and Christmas envelopes didn't come from a desk job. And she'd accepted it, because Tony had never lied to her, never raised a hand, never humiliated her, never brought the world's dirt across the family threshold. He had protected the home at all costs. And in those final years, that's where he stayed. The last major threat to his legacy came in 1992. The feds tried to link him, again, to a wide web of crimes tied to the skimming of Las Vegas casinos. They thought maybe this time they'd finally drag him into court for real. They had turned witnesses, they had flight logs, they had a timeline. What they didn't have? Proof. Tony had made sure of it decades earlier. So once again, the case stalled. The feds whispered about frustration. Prosecutors quietly retired. And Tony? He went to church that Sunday. Put a crisp bill in the offering plate, shook the priest's hand, took Clarice out for lunch. There's a question people asked, quietly, over drinks long after Tony was gone. Did he regret any of it? No one knows. But if you read between the lines of his life, if you look at the way he spent those last years, the answer leans toward no. Because regret is a luxury for the uncertain. Tony was never uncertain. He did what had to be done. He buried who needed to be buried. He spared who deserved it. He followed his code. And at the end, he could look at himself in the mirror and still see a man, not a ghost. In his last months, the physical decline became more obvious. Arthritis in the knees, slower speech, memory gaps. He started staying indoors more, didn't take calls unless he had to, didn't eat as much. But he wasn't afraid. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't clinging. He was just letting go, the way a man lets go of a long shift at a job well done, not with sorrow, but with quiet relief. On May 22, 1992, Anthony Joseph Accardo died in his home. Natural causes, no violence, no scandal, no noise. He was 86. He'd lived through Prohibition, through Capone, through 3 wars, 2 criminal empires, and dozens of FBI investigations. He died exactly the way he planned, as the last man standing. At the funeral, the pews were filled with family, not wise guys. His name was barely mentioned in the press. No cameras outside, no helicopters, just a few old men in dark suits, nodding silently. A few widows dabbing at their eyes, and the knowledge, unspoken, that an era had truly ended. Tony Accardo didn't die like a king. He died like a monk. After a lifetime of controlling chaos, he surrendered to silence, and that, in the end, was the most Accardo thing of all. Legends don't usually die in bed. That's the truth of it. They go down in flames, in shootouts, on the run, in cages, sick and forgotten, surrounded by whispers and dust. But Tony Accardo, he walked through the fire and made it out the other side. He lived through wars, real ones and street ones. He buried kings and crowned new ones. He took the worst of humanity and turned it into an institution. And when it was time, he walked away, not limping, not hiding, just done. He left no memoirs, no confession tapes, no grand letters to be read at his funeral. He left behind clean walls, silent phones, and memories that scared even the ones who loved him. Because Tony wasn't about legacy. He was about control. And control means you leave nothing behind that someone else can misuse. No breadcrumbs, no journals, no "in case I die" folders in the attic. Just absence. What remains of Tony Accardo isn't found in FBI archives or yellowed news clippings. It's found in hushed conversations, in the way men talk about discipline, in how younger soldiers, even today, are told, keep your mouth shut, do your job, be like Joe Batters. He's the ghost in every rulebook that came after, and yet he was not a ghost when he lived. He was flesh, method, precision, and his method worked longer than anyone else's. People throw around the word boss. It's used for flash, for fear, for rank, but Tony redefined it. He wasn't a boss. He was a quiet architect of criminal infrastructure. A man who understood that power isn't in violence. It's in the threat of violence never delivered. He knew that fear works best when it's never confirmed. He knew that a raised voice is a sign of weakness, that a second warning is one too many. That's what made him terrifying. That's what made him untouchable. Men feared disappointing him more than they feared dying, and that is not something you see anymore. The modern world. It's noisy. Criminals post on social media, gangsters give interviews, rats write books. Everyone wants attention, wants to be seen, to be heard, to be felt. But Tony Accardo built an empire where the greatest strength was to disappear inside your own success. No fame, no spotlight, just a long trail of clean money and quiet obedience. When you walk through Chicago today, through Little Italy, through Cicero, through the old haunts and bars that used to buzz with whispers, you won't see Tony's name carved in stone. There are no murals, no plaques, no statues. But his fingerprints are everywhere, not on things, on people. The last generation of real outfit men, the ones left breathing, still won't say his name out loud, not because they fear him now, but because the silence is still respected. And respect? That's rare. He outlived Capone, outlived Nitti, outlived Rika, outlived every boss who tried to play the game louder, dirtier, flashier. And when he was gone, there was no one left to replace him. Because you can't replace consistency that never cracks. You can't replace a man who never needed to be forgiven because he never got caught. What Accardo leaves behind isn't nostalgia. It's a warning. A lesson written not in ink but in decades of clean books, tight mouths, and one rule that never changed. Don't bring heat. Don't bring shame. And if you can't follow the code, don't come back. He was not a good man. He was not a kind man. But he was the right man for the world he ruled. And in that world, he was perfect. Maybe in the end, that's the legacy. Not gold or glory or graves, but perfection of purpose. Tony Accardo was born into nothing. He chose a life of blood and cement, and he lived it on his own terms. He was not lucky. He was prepared every day until the last. In an era where gangsters die in drive-bys or behind fences or beneath the weight of their own arrogance, Tony Accardo died in peace, surrounded by people who loved him, in a bed that he paid for, in a house that he never had to run from. And that is the rarest ending of all. So if you're still looking for him, in case you're wondering where Tony went, he's not buried in some grand tomb. He's not frozen in black and white headlines. He's in the silence. In the pause before a man answers a question he doesn't want to repeat, in the way a younger soldier keeps his tone low, his eyes down, his records clean. In the decisions made behind closed doors, the ones no one ever hears about. He's in every room where power doesn't shout. It waits, just like he did. Tony Joe Batters Accardo was many things. A killer, a father, a boss, a ghost, a man who never lost a step, because he never rushed a single one, and now he's gone. But the blueprint remains. Because for every flashy gangster with a gold watch and a microphone, there's one kid sitting quiet in the back, paying attention, learning what real power looks like, and when they ask him where he learned it, he won't say a word.